very, very much, Eddie, and thank you all for staying till, my goodness, 20 to 9 on a Thursday evening. It really does feel, coming back to Northern Ireland, it's like talking in the company of my family and my friends. And although I've spent my life, my professional life, studying all sorts of art, I wanted to talk about something this evening which is very, very literally much, much closer to home. And the question of when did art in Northern Ireland begin? Now, like many of you in this room, I was born in Belfast between the gantries and the mountains, to quote those wonderful lines by Louis MacNeice. But like Louis MacNeice, I've no longer stayed between the mountains and the gantries. I've migrated, and I've spent my working life in this funny sort of place between places, between Northern Ireland and between England, working now very, very happily as Director of Collections and Research at the National Gallery. And here's the view that I see as I come to work every morning. It couldn't be really more English than that. But I do feel always a sort of strange mixed identity. Belfast will always be home, but for many Belfast people, I don't sound Northern Irish anymore. England is where I live. I have 2 half-English children. They're also half-Irish, which is very important to me. But yet, where exactly am I? Where do I fit? And so I felt I could hardly think of anything more appropriate to talk tonight really about the origins of art in Northern Ireland, because it was actually because of art in Northern Ireland that I fled Northern Ireland in the 1990s and went away. And that's because I really couldn't deal physically with the legacy of the Troubles. Many of you who, like me, grew up in that very difficult period in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. It was really difficult. We were all told to go across the water to go to Dublin and go, and I did. And as someone who was really interested from that point with dealing with the visual world and visual history, I just couldn't feel there was a role for me here where this was just not everywhere in my way. And I think it's quite curious that still in Northern Ireland there's a real difficulty with dealing with the legacy of the past, and even the non-contentious past. I'm showing you a very dilapidated, once incredibly beautiful building that I used to walk to from home to the Ulster Museum, and now it's a wreck. I think one of the strange legacies of the Troubles is that even dealing with the non-contentious past and heritage is a very, very tricky situation in the north of Ireland. And so I went from this to something completely different. Having grown up in a world where images were difficult, I went and studied the most conventional thing you could possibly do, Renaissance Italian art history at the Courtauld Institute in London. You could hardly think of anything more different. It felt a very safe place to be. But actually, as I've grown older and reflected, I've realised that actually Northern Ireland has a much more ancient role in the history of art in some respects than does the Italian Renaissance. And I want to try and prove this point to you this evening by talking about these truly wonderful objects which are displayed in a case in the museum upstairs and which were found just about a mile from where I grew up. And this is the so-called Malone hoard. So for those of you who don't know it and haven't gone to look at it, I really, really encourage you to do so. These are a group of stones. They were made of a particular material called porcelainite, which is very, very hard, very difficult to work in any way, and is found in 2 sources, both of which are in Northern Ireland, one in the north of County Antrim and one on Rathlin Island. And these objects date from the Neolithic period, so they're about 6,000 years old. And they are worked in a very difficult way. Imagine this is a time when people didn't really have tools. This is before the Bronze Age, and yet we know that these objects are shaped, they're really rough, igneous stone. It's a stone a little bit like granite, and they're made into things that they look really, really smooth. You really want to touch them. They've been looked at, they've been worked in this way using sand and water, and so they look incredibly beautiful, and yet they have very, very sharp edges, and we're really not sure exactly what they were made for, what their purpose was. But, as I said, they were found here in Danesfort. I'm showing you the building here, which some of you will know. It's now the residence of the American consul in Northern Ireland. And in the 1860s, it was a very, very grand house. It's also now a situation for some quite beautiful housing and some not very beautiful flats like this. But it is just about a mile from here and about another mile further from where I grew up. Now, what exactly are these objects meant to do? What is their meaning? As I said, they were very, very carefully worked and made and constructed in a time when it was very, very difficult to do this, probably about 6,000 years ago, somewhere in the north of Ireland. And they were discovered sometime between the 1860s and the early 20th century in this garden in Danesfort. Now, some of them were upright. They were in all sorts of positions, and their display in the museum is not necessarily intended to give a sense of how they were there, but to give a sense of them really as art objects, which I think it's very, very successful in doing. Seamus Heaney, who also, like me, was very fascinated by this object, once wrote that there was something that was very malevolent about them. They're very beautiful, they're very strange, and they're also slightly probably sadistic. It's been thought that they were made as some form of ceremonial axe, but the curiosity about them is that there's nowhere on them where an axe head could actually have been fitted, and it's probably likely that they were used in some sort of ritual activity. Of course, that's been the role of a lot of art through human history that we don't really understand and know about. But despite the problems about them, they are incredibly beautiful, tactile objects that are very, very hard to understand. And for me, I think they make a number of points about Northern Irish art, which are really interesting if these are, as I think they probably are, the first origin of it. Firstly, that these beautiful and totally incomprehensible objects are capable of talking across the centuries to us in the 21st century in very different ways to the ways they would have done at various moments in their history and in their usage. They also show, I think, how art is shaped by its geographical context. The artists, the makers who made this, used a type of stone that was difficult to get at, but could be found in these places in Ulster, and from Ulster, we know during this time, is exported all around the British Isles, and indeed further beyond. So I think what's important to this, as a takeaway from this, is that Northern Irish art is not something that started with the Troubles, or even with the plantation. It's something that is old as the hills, and therefore we can celebrate it if we live in this part of the world or come from it, whatever our community, whatever our background. I would also say that these art objects in some ways for me typify what I would see as some of the characteristics of art from the north of Ireland. And here I'm getting into really dangerous ground. I think they have a real quiet elegance about them. They're objects that were very, very carefully made out of fine materials, but they're not showy. And I think there's that really important characteristic in Northern Irish identity that is about doing things very, very well, but is often about doing it modestly and not explicitly, at any rate, wanting to show off. They're also objects which show a great respect for tradition, but even more importantly, they are also about a spirit of innovation and change. And in short, I think Northern Irish history is often a hindrance to looking at the past and the art of the past, but here actually it was a help to creativity. So looking back at the origins of art in Northern Ireland through these objects gives me a great visceral thrill, it gives me a sense of terrifiedness sometimes, but most importantly it gives me an opportunity to escape the legacy of the Troubles. And it gives, I think, looking at the far past, an optimism and excitement for artistic production in this part of the world, not just for the present, but also for the future. Thank you.